subject today is academic freedom. It is controversial, at least in part, in what I'm going to address. And it is controversial. The fact that it is controversial is precisely why it is a subject. By that, I mean that to take a stand publicly today within a university framework on most of the issues I'm going to talk about could, part of it at least, as will become clear in a few minutes, could, depending on where that happens, cause you to be suspended from your job, or even fired, or canceled on social media, on blogs, in scientific journals, etc. One second. My tablet is having its own controlling moment. Okay. So first of all, I'm tempted to start out by saying it didn't used to be that way. So what changed? I think we're all old enough to remember a different time. But this is only a part of what I'm going to discuss today. Broadly speaking, we have two significant trends developing today that I want to look at that pose a threat to academic freedom in the sense of freedom of inquiry, threat to freedom of speech in the sense of academics having the freedom to express themselves as they see fit on and off campus. Both those trends are having dramatic effects on what can and cannot be said in a classroom and what can or cannot be published in a scientific review. One trend is the tightening grip of autocratic regimes on academe, both in terms of curricula, content, and freedom of expression. And the other is the culture wars that emerged on American campuses roughly a decade ago and have been gradually spreading since to other Western societies, and in fact across much of the world, or some of the world outside the West. With both phenomena having a tangible impact, again, on what can be taught and what can be published. So my outline for today, and I don't have an outline slide, is very simply that I'll be looking first at the autocratic trend and its effects on teaching, contents, and publication. And in a second part, I'll be looking at the woke trend. I know it's a connoted term, but it has the merit of being short, and the effects that this trend is having on teaching, content, and publication as well. By the way, I have very few slides today. Sorry about that. So you'll just have to bear with me talking away with little visual support. I'll start with the autocratic trend. And here, of course, I refer mainly to what we see happening increasingly with major effects as far as large countries are concerned, essentially in China and Russia. Other autocratic regimes, of course, engage in academic censorship in Asia, in the Middle East, but in the time frame that we have for this talk, I will stick to these two cases only, China and Russia. First, the case of China. Of course, there's never been actual academic freedom in China, but it's fair to say that in the early 2000s, for about a decade, a measure of liberalization as to what could be taught was introduced. I actually remember a friend, this is what now, some 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, a friend of mine who's an administrator at the National Assembly, the French Parliament's lower chamber, being repeatedly invited to Fudan University in Shanghai to give lectures on the French democratic institutions, the democratic institutions of the European Union, their mode of operation, okay? And this was part of a program opening up to the rest of the world and opening up to a better understanding of democratic regimes, democratic institutions, how they operate, what benefits they can have. I remember that he wasn't censored in any way in what he could say, that Chinese students there demonstrated huge interest in what he had to say. Okay, this is about 10, 12 years ago. Since the rise to power of Xi Jinping, picture has changed drastically. Severe ideological constraints have increasingly been imposed on universities. Today, more than 100 universities across China have adopted charters that proclaim their unswerving loyalty to the ruling Communist Party, usually through phrases like, the University Communist Party Committee is the core leadership of the school. Couldn't be more explicit. Which concretely means adhering to the political philosophy of Xi Jinping. Where previously most of these charters paid at least nominal tribute to academic freedom and freedom of thought, actually mentioned them, okay? Even if on campuses, the practice was not exactly up to par. One of the most recent ones to do that, to proclaim control by the Communist Party in its charter, was Fudan University itself, the university where my friend used to lecture. This was in December 2021. This move involves China's most prestigious universities, including, for example, Nanjing University, which has a prominent international study program jointly administered with Johns Hopkins in the US. Apparently, there are still a few holdouts, such as East China Normal University, which has a joint venture campuses, a number of campuses around Shanghai with New York University, and Wuhan University, which has a joint campus with Duke University, but I'm not even sure that this information is still up to date. For academics at universities with these charters, and more broadly under that regime, there is simply no freedom of speech or freedom of thought to speak of. Over the last decades, there's been a decade, I should say, there have been countless instances of lecturers and professors being at best fired. For example, for things like questioning the current relevance of Marxism during their courses, or for criticizing Xi Jinping's economic policies, not political, economic policies. Most of the control is exercised by student party members or simply by any student or group of students who sit in class and then report to party committees what is being said there. Surveillance and censorship also apply, of course, to what Chinese scholars say when participating in academic conferences abroad, which can equally jeopardize their careers once they return home. According to many Chinese academics who fled to the West because their careers had been stymied or terminated, the overall atmosphere created by this situation in Chinese academia is reminiscent of the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s under Mao Zedong. To be entirely fair to the subject, I should also go into the ways that China is equally attempting to export its forms of censorship, its warped account of reality, for example, by monitoring Chinese students enrolled at universities in the West, or by trying to push through its own praiseful account of its own model through Confucius institutes on Western campuses. But of course, for lack of time, I can't go into the detail of all that. I do want to say a word about what is happening in and outside China in the realm of scientific publication, as China has been vying for over a decade now to become a global powerhouse in this area. It goes without saying that academic publication inside China and geared to the Chinese higher education sector is heavily censored, primarily in the social sciences, but the effort reaches well beyond the confines of China, since China has been for a number of years now putting heavy pressure on Western academic publishers to apply censorship to their contents aimed at China. One of the most notorious, perhaps the most notorious case in this respect, is a request that was made in 2017 by the Chinese State Administration of Press, Publication, Radio, Film, and Television to Cambridge University Press. Publisher, among other journals, of the China Quarterly, which is a quite prestigious academic publication. The request was sort of injunction to censor, among others, all articles that made a reference to the Tiananmen events. In other words, to make them inaccessible from the Cambridge University Press website in China, inside China, to make them inaccessible, of course, to the Chinese public, to Chinese academics and students. The most alarming fact here is not merely that this happened, this is in the logic of the Chinese Communist Party rule, but it is that at first, Cambridge University Press complied. They did that in order to justify that decision. They explained that their entire website would be blocked if they didn't comply. There was, of course, an ensuing outcry, huge, within and beyond academia in the UK and across the West. And because of that, Cambridge University Press reversed its decision a few days later. But this is only one example among many of how China is trying to control the flow of information and knowledge aimed at the Chinese public, not only on its own territory, but across the world. Many other scientific publishers and journals have received similar requests, actually injunctions, and this has been an ongoing battle in scientific publishing for quite a few years. Moving on to Russia, we see a pattern that is similar in many ways, but that has been exacerbated yet further since Russia's invasion of Ukraine began last February. Like in China, a measure of academic freedom, though still constrained by Western standards at that time, began to prevail in Russian universities. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russian universities started to engage in the 1990s for the first time ever with other universities around the world, virtually putting an end to the academic isolation of the Soviet era. And that, of course, began to change with Putin's rise to power in 1999. A centralized control over Russian society, and with it over the governance and management of universities, began to expand. This included a return to the Soviet practice of appointing rectors, the Kremlin appointing rectors directly, increasing government influence on the appointment of conformist deans, let's say, and faculty, and new constraints on interpreting Russia's past and contemporary politics. So mainly like in China, control mainly felt in the social sciences. These patterns of forcing Russia's universities to comply with the Kremlin's political rhetoric accelerated, of course, in the period leading up, even before the period leading up to the invasion of Ukraine. Over the past year, Putin has cleansed leadership across dozens of universities, including those that have had long-standing partnerships with Western universities. And in many universities, the FSB itself, the Secret Service, is now actively participating in the review of student admissions and academic personnel cases. And since March 4th, both academics and students, public that has been overrepresented in the protest movements early into the war, many academics, for example, signing open letters of condemnation of the war. I'm talking about the early days, right? The early weeks. of the war, up until March 4th anyway, all of them became, like everybody else in Russia, liable to imprisonment for up to 15 years if they publicly criticize Putin's decision to wage that war. That law essentially ended not only any semblance of a free press that Russia might still have had prior to that, but the concept of academic freedom itself in Russia. Since then, the Kremlin has put pressure on university rectors to publish statements in support of the war. Most of them have complied. This combines with a sweeping movement across universities in North America and in Europe, and at the European Commission to terminate partnerships and other collaborative exchanges with Russian universities and academics. Even the OECD has suspended its programs, such as PISA, for example, and others in Russia. And as many university professors are among the hundreds of thousands who have fled Russia, in the wake of the invasion, all of this means that Russian academia and universities as a whole now find themselves in growing global isolation after years of greater interaction with colleagues abroad and a period of greater academic freedom, as I described a few minutes ago. Okay, so that's for the autocratic world. Let's now take a look at what's going on in the democratic world, and by that I mean the woke trend. And here, of course, I'm sure that you are familiar with the main facts, roughly over the past decades, whether it's referred to as culture wars, cancel culture, wokeism, critical race theory, and critical gender studies. More generally, let's say critical theory has gradually penetrated curricula and campuses across American colleges and universities, and has then spread in more or less diluted forms to other institutions across the West, especially the Anglophone ones, but not restricted to them. And it's also beginning to expand, has begun to expand wherever possible in the developing world. This has begun to raise significant questions about free speech and the freedom of intellectual inquiry in higher education, in countries where, because they are democratic, unlike in the autocratic world, studying at university has long been viewed as more than these values, in the values of free debate, free inquiry, academic freedom, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, etc. I want to mention one book, which is a seminal early book, probably the first book, comprehensive book that was published on the phenomenon, because it explores the genesis and the rise of this in the US. It's this is one of, I think, 3 slides that I have, so I'm still going to share. I'm sure you're familiar with it anyway. Okay, this is it, but this is not the right slide. See, I have 3 slides altogether. Can you see it? Yeah, I am screen sharing. The coddling of the American mind. How good intentions and bad ideas are setting up a generation for failure. This was published in 2018. 2 authors, Jonathan Haidt, who's a social psychologist, and Greg Lukianoff, who's a journalist. In the book, the authors describe how students born in and after 1995, what they call the internet generation, began upon their arrival on American campuses, that was by 2013, to push for a radical restructuring of academic life, and to spread a culture of safetyism, understood as a claim that the right to feel emotionally and psychologically safe trumps what were previously considered core liberal values, such as free speech. And this prompted students to make increasingly vocal demands for safe spaces on campus, i.e. spaces devoid of bias, conflict, criticism, or potentially threatening actions, ideas, conversations, and also for trigger warnings. In other words, statements cautioning that content, such as in a text or video or class, may be disturbing or upsetting. And then letting students who want to do so just leave the classroom or do something else while their disturbing contents are being showed or expressed. Mirroring this growing trend on Western campuses, we have seen what now virtually amounts to an academic revolution, reshape curricula and research, first and foremost in the social sciences and humanities, but then increasingly across all scientific fields, including STEM, in which more and more content is now required to abide by the broad pattern of interpretation of the school derived. This is really kind of almost caricatural because it's so sketchy, but let's just say derived from Marx and from French theory, in particular Bourdieu, that vastly sees human history as one of a binary division between oppressing elite groups on the one hand, and on the other, the rest of society, which is made of oppressed groups, i.e. women, and minority groups characterized by their sexual orientation and or racial identity, what is now broadly known as decolonizing curricula and research. Of course, I can't go into all the details of this saga here, nor do I think it's necessary. I want to focus instead on the consequences that this trend is having on academic freedom and freedom of speech, especially on American campuses, but again, increasingly spreading tangibly, at least to the rest of the West. I see the consequences of it in my own school day after day, for example, compared to what things were like even 4 or 5 years ago. There's been quite a tangible change that you can see in many different areas, but in particular in the way that the school is steering academic preferences and modes of communication and what conduct instructors should have in the classroom with students, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even friends, okay? The most visible manifestations of this have been the, as you know, deplatforming or no platforming of guest speakers deemed unpalatable by vocal groups of students, or the much more consequential cancellation of academics for words either published or expressed in class or on social media. And this trend is now affecting free speech at multiple levels of academia. Countless scholars in the US, for example, are now being refused publication if the contents of their research is deemed by the editorial board to violate the tenets of critical theory. Dozens upon dozens of professors over the past few years have been suspended or fired by their university administration for speech expressed in class or elsewhere on campus that students or student groups have denounced, usually on social media, for not towing the line. To illustrate the effect that this is having on free speech, about which an ever-growing amount of data is piling up, I will just mention one study, one student-focused study, student rather than academics, because it's even more preoccupying, I think, when it's about students. The study was carried out in the US in September 2020 by an organization called College Pulse. It's an online survey and analytics company that researches the attitudes, preferences, and behaviors of college students. It claims that this study is the largest ever free speech survey of American college students conducted, as the study involved over 37,000 students across 159 universities. And the organization used that data to establish the first college free speech rankings of American universities and colleges. Here are some of the most prominent findings. You can see them here. 80% of students surveyed reported censoring their viewpoints at school at least some of the time. Over 50% identified racial inequality as a difficult topic to discuss on campus. 66% said it is acceptable to shout down a speaker to prevent them from speaking on campus, and 23% said it's acceptable to use violence to stop a campus speech. And these are only some of the key findings, not to exhaust your patience in this study. There's countless of other studies that document these rising censorship practices across Western campuses, which are increasingly encouraged by university administration. And to summarize what is happening here, I would underscore a paradox. And it is this, that at a time when the higher education sector increasingly emphasizes the need for more inclusion and more diversity in the recruitment of students, there seems to be in parallel a sharp decline in the fostering of diversity of thought, diversity of perspectives, the two going on in parallel. In the US, this situation has become an actual war of words and ideas, with the conservative backlash that this has generated, that has prompted, for example, states like Florida, Texas, and other states, to conservative states, of course, Republican, to pass legislation that bans the teaching of critical race theory altogether, or a critical account of American history. But these efforts have essentially focused on the K-12 cycle and have not really had a profound impact at the level of higher education. The main difficulty in addressing this issue is that virtually, in public, is that virtually any position expressed on it is doomed, no matter the intent, to be politically labeled by one side or the other of the sharply polarized divide that opposes proponents and critics of this developing academic climate. Okay, this is, of course, this has been the case in the US for quite a few years, and it is increasingly the case in Europe. It is the case in the UK, definitely. And as I said, we can witness this happening and developing in France as well. It's definitely been the case over the past few years. So far, in Europe, a handful of government attempts to counter the trend, a little bit in the UK with the Tories in power now for a number of years, a little bit in France. Macron seems to be kind of ambivalent about it, sometimes taking strong stands against it, sometimes not. But that's basically the big picture, okay? So my first question to you, I'm finished, by the way, thank you for your attention and patience. But I have two main questions to ask you. The first one is probably the more controversial one. Do you see any similarities in the two parts I have developed today? Or do you think it is a gross exaggeration to compare what is going on American and broadly Western campuses to the situation in autocratic countries like China and Russia? And then the second question, or couple questions, will be about what we can do about it. But let's first focus. So now I'm turning the floor over to you. Do you see some similarities in the context situations that I have just described, the two of them, or do you think it's a gross exaggeration to draw that kind of parallel? You have to share. Today, it's not an option to just remain seated in your little corner and remain silent. What do you think?
Let's jump in and get opinions rolling thereafter for what it's worth. Glenn Chatelier from Assumption University. Thanks, Corinne. Okay, I would say this: as long as the trends have been towards the commercialization of education, you know, and the mechanisms within education to produce what is seen as market results in terms of employability and all of that stuff, it seems to me that the controlling factors of over all of these have become an overbearing political will. Now, the politicians are not being involved constructively, but they are being involved rather restrictively to see, to kind of program how education is imparted and to what ends can they use the mechanisms of education and the products of education to further what they claim to be the general good of all. Okay, so I see this as one clear trend. Okay, and therefore, in the general environment of authoritarianism on the one hand, and number two, the uncontrollable factors within democracy like freedom of speech, for example, and hate speech or fake news becoming pretty much, fashionable. I think what has happened is that the sacrosanct borders of academe have become kind of diluted by these trends coming in. And unfortunately, the academics have not been strong enough to stand up, either to shut out these influences or to justify them if they so desire. My experience of the overbearing authoritarian, influence, let's say, of the Chinese government on education was through a French professor who once spoke here in the Kingdom of Thailand. And he claimed that he was granted an honorary status in the Communist Chinese Party and all of that stuff, and claimed that he was an economist by background, and justified the displacement of pheasants and farmers from farming lands for the construction, industry. And today we know that those construction sites are all ghost towns, and the farmers have been thrown into greater charity. And the professor, I mean, to my surprise, was so pro China, and I was wondering, hey, what the hell is this? I mean, he's supposed to be a French professor, but taken over by the Chinese point of view. He's since kind of almost mellowed down or disappeared. I haven't heard from him in quite a while. Okay, but this is an example that I'm talking about, all right, where the controlling factors, government, the Politburo, the Communist Central Party, be it in China, Russia, they want to control education and what's imparted to the students as a type of conditioning, okay, to get them to behave in certain ways, okay, and that to me has created quite a bit of restriction in the freedom that students enjoy. I'm not going to pick up on the case of Thailand, where I currently teach, because it's quite sensitive. There is a deep political divide, caused by certain politicians who seek a total regime change in the traditional monarchy and whatever form of democracy that we have. But we have since discovered that these politicians have axles to grind. They have their own self-interests, and their political visions. And what they've done really is to use innocent students as their mouthpieces, as their kind of vehicles to go out onto the streets. And I will keep away from that topic because it's still very hot and heated. But for what it's worth, this is my input.
So does that mean that, if I understand correctly what you've said, that would you say that the main difference between the two forms or the two trends that we're talking about is that in the case of autocratic regimes, this is put in place, run, administered, decided upon, first of all, by governments, by the regime, to serve the interests of the regime, whereas in the West, this is happening at the initiative, basically, of civil society agents. It's not governments imposing these views on academia. Would you say that this is one major difference, which I don't think anyone
Yes.
could argue against, if
Yeah,
that's what
yeah,
you were
yeah.
implying?
But also, I mean, in the broader West, as we know it, United States, case in point, and I would say to a certain extent in Great Britain, what we've seen is that the political forces have kind of told academic institutions, you're either for us or against us. So get with it, okay? And chant the same phrases or sing the same song, or else we may disenfranchise you. Okay, and I mean, you know, this is something very shocking. It's very true, and it does have spillover effects in a country like Thailand, where the university rectors right now are cribbed and confined by policy and directions, and where is it that they stand? And none of them have a stand. Okay, so I give you a rather bleak picture, but it's a very honest picture.
Well, this whole subject is bleak.
That's right.
As a matter of fact. Bart, do you want to say something? You need to unmute your mic. We can't hear what you're saying.
Now, hello, now?
Okay,
now
Francisco, you want to jump in meantime? Bart, you
Sure.
need to activate your mic. Francisco?
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you for the presentation and the introduction of the topic. I think it's a very important topic to discuss, especially among the International Federation of Catholic Universities. So my name is Francisco Lara. I'm a tenure professor. I'm actually in the US at Washington, D.C., at the Catholic University of America, at the business school. But I'm also an ordinary professor of business in Spain at Valencia. So I'm one semester here. To understand what I'm going to tell now, it's important, this introduction. So I can do a double approach about the topic from the US perspective and also from the Spanish perspective. No? So trying to answer the question that you mentioned, I see many similarities of the topic you are introducing here. In fact, my business school here at Catholic University in Washington is really committed and engaged on these topics, especially the woke movement. And an example of that is just last Friday, we introduced a movie about Jimmy Lai, what is happening with Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong, how is completely shut down in the media, you cannot see what is going on, and how the Chinese government is controlling the freedom of speech and also the freedom of economy in this particular region, and how the UK basically didn't do nothing to stop that. The second point is what I see is the education. And now let me go to Spain. So in Spain, what is going on now exactly is something that you mentioned before, is the position of the presidents at universities, public or private universities, is basically trying to be controlled by the government. So I think we are really in a very problematic situation, because the government actually is a combination of socialists and communists in the government in Spain. So they are trying to take over the education system, in particular with the appointments of the presidents. So, for example, before to be appointed a president, you have to be a tenure or ordinary professor. But nowadays, it's not going to be anymore the case. So you can be appointed as a president, especially in the public or state universities, not in the private universities. But so this is a real threat for the freedom of speech. thanks God, in most private universities, for example, Catholic universities like us, so we don't have that problem, so we can speak without the freedom. And I don't see that in my, but it's true that I'm in a bubble. No, I'm not in a real, but talking with my peers, my colleagues in different universities in the US and also in Spain, I see that very clear. They cannot speak freely what they think about the issue. So I think it's absolutely essential, the topic you are bringing here. And I think it's very interesting what we can do. I think I don't have many information about
that. That's going to be my next question.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to pursue for another just couple minutes the question on similarities or no resemblance at all, and then we'll move on to what can be done. Bart?
Thanks, Corinne, and again, thank you for a very stimulating presentation. What I think there are very strong similarities between the two sections of your talk. I suppose I see them based on perceptions of truth. Universities are places that will pursue truth. Now, the question as to whether or not the Chinese government has a view of truth that it wishes to see being pursued in its universities, I think it must be a question that would be of some interest to us. So it raises the question, what is truth? That, for me, that's the first thing. Second issue is when I'm involved with a Christian university, a Catholic university indeed, in Jordan. It is the only Catholic university in Jordan. Jordan is 97% Muslim. The question of whether the church, the Catholic Church, has the right to express views of its Christianity in that Muslim society arises, and what is the balance between the two? One has to be very cautious about how you express it, but it's the right of the owner, the right of the people who in a private university set up a university with certain values and so on. Do they have the right to express views that support the university? And I think it would be a fair comment for IFCU to address the question in terms of freedom of speech. Does a member of staff or a research group or whatever have the right to publish material that is clearly hostile to the teaching of the church? Does it have the right to do that? And on one hand, you would say, yes, of course it has the right. We should be open to all those kinds of things. But if there's a kind of persistent bringing of the university into kind of, let me say, public disrepute, because it is ideologically driven by something that is hostile to the church, I think that raises some questions. And I think the only other comment I have in what you're saying, Corinne, is, you know, in some ways, when you look at the nature of research that is published, most of it, even in the social sciences, is based on quantification.
Yeah,
Is that in itself a form of kind of censorship underneath the system that says the only research we hear about is quantifiable research, not based on issues of values and discernment and these sorts of things? So I think the academic community itself needs to look at the question, is the kind of publications that we are producing a form of not exactly censorship, but orientating our academic thinking in one direction rather than being as broad as one would hope it would be? And so I think the answer to your questions is yes, there's a very close connection between the two themes that you had. Some of it is for the academic community to address. Some of it is in this very tricky political area, and particularly political area where you find the government funding of universities and those governments being driven by the Muslim way of thinking or some other political ideology. And I think these are important questions that you've raised.
Thank you for this. But my next question, which is of course connected and that has already cropped up in what you've been saying is, and I'm really putting the question to you because if that question was put to me, I don't really know that I would be able to answer it, is the question of whether, first of all, what should or what can be done, okay, within academia, within the higher education sector. What can be done by universities to, I don't know what the right word is, combat these trends, counterbalance these trends. But more specifically, my question would be whether you think that there might be a specific role for Catholic institutions of higher education that no other types of higher education institutions could fulfill as well in this particular context. And again, I'm not sure I'm able to answer what that might be, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Is there anything that Catholic colleges and universities would be able to do from their specific standing in this respect? And I'm talking on both sides, right?
Yeah.
Vis-a-vis autocratic regimes that have hollowed out academic freedom and the entire meaning of academic research and academic study, and what is going on in the West.
I think if I can talk, or
sure.
So just to follow.
That's the whole idea.
Yeah. Now, following the Professor McGerrick question that I think is critical, what is the truth? At Catholic universities, some experience that we have here recently, and it's very provocative, the question he mentioned is how in a Catholic university can an idea against the ideology of the mission of the university can be discussed. We have recently a guest speaker who was really provocative. So among the university here, Catholic University, there was a group of students who raised their complaint against that professor to come to campus to talk about that issue that was really controversial. And the president of the university make from my point of view, very interesting email to all the community to say, if we are a Catholic university, what we expect here is that we can discuss different ideas, different perspectives. So to even with people who don't have our same point of view, because it's there in that discussion where you can learn, through the comparative perspective. So, and think the other way around. Imagine that we are not in a Catholic university, but in a Muslim university. What will be the case in a Muslim university if somebody tried to discuss a topic that is controversial to, or in the other way around, what if in China is happening? So I think that will be very interesting to see the different, it's different, you will see different conclusions, different outcomes, And relate to the second point that Professor McGerrick mentioned is the quantitative or qualitative. I think it's not or and. I think it's not or, but and. So we need both. We need qualitative studies and qualitative publications, but also quantitative, because science and art. So we need the discussion of scientific and I'm involved really in many research projects. And my perspective, but we need to start with a qualitative approach, I think, and that's the point, to discuss the ideas, the values, what is but then we will need to move into the data, to analyze the data and the correlation between the data and the values, not the ideas. But I think the key point, of course, is the value. No?
If I could follow that up, Corinne,
Sure.
just and thank you, Francisco, for those remarks. If I had $5 for every time I said to a student, there is more to evidence than that which you can measure. In other words, you can discern evidence. And I think that's where the Catholic universities have a tradition of discernment in their spirituality and in much of their thinking and philosophies and so on. And I think that that's where Catholic universities should be talking up the idea that there is more to evidence than that which you can quantify. There is evidence that you can discern, but it's not yet sufficiently strong in its research basis for it to be accepted widely. You know, people will still come back and say, how valid is it? How reliable is discernment? And so on and so on. So they will use those kind of concepts to judge the evidence. I have to say, I think all evidence should be subject to scrutiny and validity, reliability, and so on. But you can have discerned evidence, and I think that's a contribution that IFCU could make. The significance of discernment as a research tool. That would certainly be one area, and I think a very fruitful area. Now, it's not that it doesn't exist, but it's not prominent enough. And I would love to see IFCU run a seminar or even set of seminars on discernment as a basis of academic research.
So you're actually putting the emphasis on the method, the epistemology.
Yes.
What makes knowledge valid? And that's consistent with what you said earlier about truth, the pursuit of truth.
Truth, yeah.
Okay, so that's consistent and attractive. Food for thought. Yeah. Anybody else before we conclude? We're just about, our time is just about up, but anybody? We are definitely thinking about putting together some kind of program of various activities, but addressing this in some way. I have to say, and I've pointed this out in my talk, that it's a difficult subject to talk about. It's difficult in the sense that, of course, we have freedom of speech. We can say and publish anything we want. It's not so much the problem. The problem is that if you want to have an impact beyond perhaps the community of Catholic universities, you need to have other actors come and join you and join this debate. Otherwise, it's just an internal thing, and it doesn't really have an impact, beyond the membership of IFCU. Or if you want to have a greater impact than that, then you need to call on outsiders, outside experts to come and express themselves as well. And that's not an easy thing, even in a country like France. I assume perhaps Francisco, Bart, I'm not even asking you because I know more about what's going on there, but in Spain, I'm a little bit less informed. I assume the problem would be the same in Spain, right? To have an open, free-flowing, free debate on those issues and try to invite good, able experts on these questions might be a bit difficult.
Yeah, I have an experience, sorry to take the voice again. I have an experience here in the US that I think we can take profit on. It was not at my university, it was in a think tank. You know, in Washington, DC, there is a lot of think tanks here. So, but I was surprised because it was organized by Witherspoon Institute, it's from Princeton. So Robbie George create a table, a round table with Robbie George is a professor, is a Catholic professor, a Christian professor, but with a Muslim professor and a Jew professor talking about secularism. And the table was full of people, the audience, because everybody's interested in what's going on in the world with secularism. So this approach, I think the work has some connotation of secularism there. So, and all the people from different religions, different backgrounds was really interested on how we protect, if we think we should protect the transcendence, the vision of the transcendental vision or motivation of the world, not just the Catholics or Christians or Protestant, but so I was really moved by that initiative. I know it's difficult to do that, but that will be some idea going in the direction you were mentioning.
But it's a very creative idea, actually, to create some kind of interfaith dialogue on these subjects, but which is I haven't seen it. Maybe it's something that's going on somewhere, but I haven't really seen anything like this on a significant scale.
There's quite a lot of it going on in the Middle East, Corinne.
But not on these subjects, Bart. I know there's a lot of interfaith dialogue going on about all kinds of things. Sure. I'm now trying to discuss ways that Catholic institutions could take the initiative in trying to do something, and then an interfaith approach to these very questions of the freedom of the free pursuit of knowledge, the idea of truth, methodologies, epistemology, all of this. Put in the context of an interfaith dialogue might be very, very interesting.
I'm sure it would be very interesting, and I think it would be very fruitful. What I would say, however, Corinne, is that in my experience of dealing with these issues on the ground in Palestine and Israel and Jordan, the issue is not so much the faith dimension as the problems of extremism. It's not the faith, it's the tendency towards extremism that is the greatest problem. Now, that might just be a dimension of your discussion when you have it in the interfaith discussions. But I think starting with the interfaith discussion, great. But to me, when you look at it and when you feel it on the ground in places like Jordan, it's the extremism that is the real barrier. And that extremism. That extremism can be from Christians or Jews.
Exactly.
Or
That's what I was going to say. Every faith has its extremists, and secularism also has its extremists, right? So that could be, of course, you'd have to pick your interlocutors very carefully, I suppose. But the way that extremists are interfering with the whole process could be part of the debate. So that could actually be very fruitful. Okay, I'm gonna have to leave soon. Does anybody have any other bit of wisdom? Perhaps the people who are behind these dark circles who have not activated their cameras but would like nevertheless to participate. You don't have to activate your camera, but your mic, yes. Anybody? Okay.
Just to wish everyone a very happy Christmas. And
of course, and thank you very much. And I think, this is a good format. As it happens, I wanted to open the debate today, but I think I might adopt this form actually in future webinars as well, whatever the subject, because I think it's a lot more interesting than me just yakking away for 30 minutes and then a handful of questions and sometimes none. So it's a great, thank you. You're giving me great inspiration. Thanks a lot.